A mysterious darkness conquered the island of Melanat. There was either a god or a demon who controlled the island, and no one tried to go there.
Kingsfield is the second game in the Kingsfield series and the first Kingsfield to be officially released in North America, Kingsfield. The initial entry was a Japanese exclusive available in December of '94, less than 2 weeks after the launch of the original PlayStation. This sequel was developed and published by From Software, with ASCI2 Entertainment handling the North American port.
ASCII Entertainment.
It was created in 6 months, which is simply astounding considering how much it builds off its predecessor. The European version dropped half a year later with SCEE handling distribution over there, while the Western NTSC one wasn't available until a full month later on February 14th, 1996. I'll be referring to this thing as Kingsfield 2 from here on out to avoid confusion. Why they released this stuff this way is anyone's guess. Even if it is the first game to make it over here, it should have retained the 2 in the name. There was a Goonies exclusive for the Famicom, but its sequel was still called Goonies 2 over here. Personally, I'm still a bit annoyed that the first one didn't see the light of day in North America. There was far less text to translate in that one, and it's a great introduction to the series. Also, I can't be the only one who prefers the original artwork. The text is more consistent across all three, with interesting abstract images that better complement the content. What we got over here was very flashy, colorful illustrations with a gaudy font, but more on that when we cover the final installment in this 32-bit trilogy. Visually, this game is more of the same, but in the 6 months since the first entry, From Software have done a lot to create a more open, cohesive world. Kingsfield was a sprawling dungeon crawler divided into 5 unique floors that flowed horizontally. This time around, the world is densely packed, like a bundle of cords and wires. Things are stacked far more vertically, with plenty of confusing corridors to traverse. The first few times I played this back in the day, I found it off-putting. I'd frequently give it a spin before growing impatient after an hour or so. It took me a while to get familiar with the layout, and I've got to admit that some of the village regions still confuse me to this day. It's clear that these developers understood how to create a nice, interconnected, compact world, and it's always satisfying to discover a new shortcut to an earlier area, but sometimes it feels like they were trying to pad out the length. A few central locations are needlessly perplexing. Maybe it's just me, but even after sinking dozens of hours into this thing, I'd still get turned around attempting to make my way to a specific place. Kingsfield 2 is like a tightly packed bed of snakes. Each room splits into at least a few others, making it very tricky to fully explore. It doesn't help that the reliable compass from the original has been reworked into a strange, stylized orb that rotates as you move around. Personally, I'm not a fan of numerical gauges in lieu of the more traditional meter display. I just find it easier to be able to glance at the information when it's illustrated in the style present in the original game. I'm also not completely on board with this new compass outside of the tease that it may somehow, some way, spell out sex at any given point. The controls haven't changed much, a few of the face buttons have been rearranged, but everything operates the same. Strafing is done with the triggers, as are the limited camera movements. Enemies attack from above as well as below this time around, so pivoting up and down is crucial. In the first game, the vast majority were right in front of you and could be struck down from a single position, so it's definitely an improvement to have some variety in this regard. Story-wise, there's a lot more going on here. The original Kingsfield told a tight little tale. Jean-Alfred Forrester's arc tied itself up nicely by the end, a rare case of From Software wrapping things up in a tidy, pleasant bow. Tonally, this sequel's narrative shares more in common with the company's modern-day fantasy titles. Everyone is miserable. The majority of the events play out in the worst sort of ways, and a lot of the finer details need to be worked out by the player. You are Granatiki Prince Aleph, or Alexander if you prefer, a man who has been tasked with exploring the land of Melanat in order to retrieve the Moonlight Sword, which was rebuilt in the previous adventure by Forrester. There are two mystical blades, dark and light, crafted by a pair of opposing dragon lords. The land of Verdite from the first game is only mentioned in passing at the beginning, as well as a few times in item descriptions. Your goal is to reclaim the magical MacGuffin and return it to King Alfred Forrester of Verdite. The beginning of the game sees you, Aleph, washed up on the shores of Melanat, the sole survivor of a shipwreck. All of your gear has been stripped from your body. There are more characters to interact with, but it's never disruptive. You can get as much out of this thing narratively as you'd like. It shares a lot in common with the modern Souls games, as NPCs carry on with their business whether you engage with them or not. Completing side quests usually rewards the player with helpful gear, and there are quite a few hidden items to collect if you decide to put in the effort. The faceless denizens of Melanat have some pretty big problems. Throughout the game you'll discover a slave mining operation, allusions to religious archetypes, and townsfolk trapped within a variety of unfortunate circumstances. There's a man named Ernest, who I guess is pretty important, but what I found most interesting is that he's wearing a vest. Like, is it a rule that all men named Ernest need to wear a vest? As usual, I won't be spoiling much here, and most of the plot threads worked for me until the very end, where things wandered a bit too far into the sci-fi realm. For you serious lore fanatics, there's an item called the Truth Glass that works similarly to the Scan Visor in Metroid Prime. It describes environments, creatures, and friendly characters when activated, and helps to piece together some of the more nebulous narrative bits. Fortune teller is tucked away in a fairly well-hidden area as well, who will explain any item in your inventory. Goods lack a description when they are picked up, which is an odd omission as it was a feature present in the first game. Some of these objects are self-explanatory with enough information given in the menus, but there are more than a few that are straight up cryptic. There's easily at least triple the amount of goodies to gather in this sequel. Herbs, antidotes, and dragon crystals return, as do keys. This time around, unlocking chests, gates, and secret doors feels a lot more logical though. The magician's key will often reveal treasures related to spells. Prison gates normally unlock with the use of a singular tool, and so on. New to the series are rhombus keys, which are interesting additions as they are meant to be reused numerous times. These are normally found around enemy base camps or on the corpses of defeated soldiers, and add a puzzle-like quality to the environments. If you use one to enter a passageway, you'll need another to return, so it's important to be aware of your surroundings. These can also be removed from their slots, which is a nifty feature, and there's a shopkeeper who can replicate them or any key in the game really. I feel like Dark Souls 2 tried to recapture this with the Pharos Lockstones, only in that game they couldn't be reused or copied. I see a lot of similarities between Kingsfield 2 and that sloppy Souls sequel. Now don't get me wrong, I dig Dark Souls 2 a lot, but it's not always the nicest thing to look at. Kingsfield is drab and kind of ugly, but much like its predecessor, I feel like the dated visuals add to the overall oppressive nature of the story. It's stylish in its own way, with creepy environments and interesting enemy designs. The gallery of baddies is almost entirely new. Skeletons have returned, and there's a callback to the first game with one guarding a wooden shield behind a hidden path at the very beginning. For those wondering where you're melon at, there are heaps of quartered watermelon flora baddies in Melanat. Two-headed poison-purging escargot roam this island far before the ones seen in Elden Ring. Termites, jaunty jizz condoms, kraken creatures, oversized Blighttown bugs, and a few soldiers that again remind me of Dark Souls 2 with their shuffle-footed hover movements. As you make your way through the winding pathways of the island, you'll be introduced to a wide variety of foes until the very end. Gemstone-eyed dinosaurs, crystalline ice golems, and a huge amount of deadly traps. 6 months. It took From Software half a year to develop this much content. Most of the enemies are placed in regions that complement their attack patterns and have decent descriptions written up to expand their lore. There are far more bosses, but they unfortunately lack life bars or any spectacular features. Most are oversized versions of common enemies, and very few pose much of a threat until the very end of the game, where you'll need to survive a gauntlet in order to reach one of the final big bads. It's certainly an improvement over the 1.5 we got in the previous entry, but I still found the majority of these battles to be underwhelming. One can be tackled at the very beginning, but it's more of a warning to players than anything. It is way beyond your character's starting stats and works to punish careless newcomers. Another can be found fairly early on, but then there's nothing for a long stretch. I mean, sure, you can tackle things in whatever order you'd like, but I think it would have been nice to have a couple more unique bosses sprinkled throughout the first half. The final stretch will pit you up against several in a row, which is fine and all, but once you've committed to exploring this area, there's no turning back, unless you decide to warp out, which resets them all. It's okay, but if you stumble into this sequence under-leveled without a key placed in one of the altars, you're kinda boned. A few items can be collected to quick travel between save stations. Each of these correlates with a gate device. For instance, a moon key can be dropped into any pedestal, and the moon gate will transport you back to that location at the cost of some magic. Sun key, sun gate, star key, star gate.
How you doing?
You get the picture. This is a very clever system that encourages the player to be mindful of their surroundings. Typically, I tend to spread these keys deliberately across Melanat, so I have access to both the east and western shorelines, as well as one positioned somewhere central, so I'm not having to wander all over the place every time I want to get something done. What I like is how it's up to you to remember which key corresponds with a specific area. It's an inventive system that rewards exploration, as all but one of these warping tools are well hidden. Stumbling upon one of these gadgets is such a thrill, but unfortunately, it is very possible to get stuck if you either don't know they exist or haven't collected a set. This is probably my biggest gripe about Kingsfield 2. It shouldn't be possible in any game to corner yourself. There are dead ends everywhere, whether it be an inescapable hole or a one-way minecart detour. What's worse is that a few of these areas contain important pickups, and the game won't save all of your items if you haven't manually done so yourself. I'm sure some could argue that it's all part of the risk-reward nature of Kingsfield, but I don't think it's fair. It's possible to just blindly fall into a hole that has no way out other than to warp, and that's just greasy. There are too many variables involved. Not only will you need to have found and set a key to be used in conjunction with a gate, but you'll also need enough magic to get it all to work. These aren't really issues a few hours into the game, as you'll likely have more than enough resources at your disposal, but MP is extremely limited during the opening stretch, almost to the point of absurdity, and I have to reiterate that it is very possible to screw yourself over in this open world if you explore regions beyond your level. It's particularly off-putting if you've completed an entire area, or worse yet, defeated a boss, only to accidentally dunk yourself into a dead end. It happened to me after spending over an hour in the termite's nest. I erroneously tackled this section before having the proper tools. It took me a hell of a long time to eliminate the Queen Big Bad, and was super pumped until I fell through a trap floor into an inescapable underwater pit. Kingsfield should reward players who explore, not penalize them this harshly. There's fair, fun challenge, and then there's just mean-spirited garbage, and I definitely feel like this falls into the latter category. I'd like to defend the developers by saying it could have been an oversight, but this is something that can occur in a number of different spots. I learned my lesson and decided to get good, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't tarnish my experience a bit. Reloading a save is strange. Naturally, you'll need to manually interact with a crystal and create a slot, but when you die, you'll be sent back to the very beginning unless you have unlocked a specific fountain and have an item to send you there. When you die, you'll need to load up your latest file, which feels like an unnecessary step, but whatever. It's harmless and doesn't take too long, but if you have a dragon crystal in your inventory, things are a bit different. So, these things aren't all that rare, and there are trees that grow them, which, by the way, is a really cool touch. The problem I have is that if you kick the bucket while holding onto one, you'll automatically respawn at the central fountain. There's nothing inherent inherently wrong with this conceptually, but it would have been nice to have the option to reload from a save point instead, as these items also refill your health and magic when consumed. Sometimes I don't want the game to automatically use one up when I perish, but I guess that's on me for being careless. I guess I just need to get good. The getting around isn't as slow as before thanks to the sprint mechanic. Enemies aren't nearly as docile as they were in the first game because now it's easier to circle strafe. Running drains an enormous amount of stamina from both the HP and MP gauges for whatever reason, but doing so also allows Alexander to sort of glide over short gaps, which comes in handy when trying to avoid trapdoors in the floors. Melanat is a large, relatively seamless land with nary a load time to be found outside of save stations. In a lot of ways it reminds me of the first Metroid. It's possible to explore entire regions out of the intended order, which is oh so satisfying. I don't care for hand-holding at all, and this thing definitely doesn't want to guide you in the slightest. As you chip away at the many areas, you'll unlock shortcuts, showcasing how proficient these developers were at creating interesting, cohesive worlds, even back in the day. There are maps to be found in every environment, and there are informative carvings describing nearby areas in the walls, as well as signs to make navigation a bit easier. It's simple to pinpoint your location with the assistance of these guides, but tricky to account for the verticality, and there are a lot of hidden passageways that aren't represented. I consider this a good thing, though, as it forced me to truly absorb myself in the world. All in all, the interconnected design is pretty good, with enough landmarks to make note of. Patterns and colors change far more frequently than its predecessor, and everything is a lot less bland to look at. Some diaper dump vomit walls still exist, but you can tell the developers were trying to improve the general art design. I'm a huge fan of this take on the open world formula, but I wouldn't say it's better than the puzzle box structure of the first Kingsfield. The original had a fun dungeon crawler feel that I'm sometimes in the mood for. It's more curated. This sequel is an entirely different beast, and equally satisfying in its own way. It's intricate with its many passageways that connect together, just like the first Dark Souls and how there were so many ways to return to the Firelink Shrine. It's a great feeling to stumble upon a familiar region after wandering around lost. No longer does your character phase through hidden passageways. Secrets are revealed behind large doors, but there are also smaller nooks that open within walls and spike traps that get triggered with a push of the action button. Skellies pop out of chests, and you'll need to visit the menu screen when inflicted by a status effect. Dark, curse, paralyze, poison, plenty of poison, but there are tons of cures lying around. Dis-poison. There's really no need to waste gold on weapons or armor. I think the developers did their best to discourage this by making armaments and gear unreasonably expensive. Keys are a good investment, as are health herbs and other replenishing items. One of the shopkeepers crafts permanent goods from crystals found throughout Melanat's many caves. This is a terrific option, as he can create flasks for you to refill at any water source. At first, these pools and streams are scarce, but as you push forward, a fountain can be activated, allowing different colored liquids to flow. These have different effects, with the gold being the best as it refills both your health and MP. My biggest complaint when it came to the original game was that the fountain always remained on the first floor, which forced a lot of backtracking. That's been fixed. NPCs also move around as you push the story forward, which solves the problem of everything being locked to one central location. There's more when it comes to weapon variety. Some chop vertically while others strike horizontally. Enemy weaknesses vary, with most being pretty clear and logical. Skeletons crumble under the heft of a large bludgeoning tool, while the many flavors of jello dissipate with a few magic strikes. A cool touch is that a lot of the rooms filled with poison baddies include a green slime, which can cure your status ailments at the risk of some health. Some enemies, such as the Zelda 2 type monsters, steal MP. Now, speaking of magic, elemental crystals are hidden everywhere. When used, they add a new spell which can be tossed into your loadout and swapped in the menus. There are 5 classes of magic: fire, earth, water, light, and wind, with 4 variations per type. It's entirely possible to overlook one of these upgrades, as most are well hidden, but they aren't necessary to complete the game. Like the original Kingsfield, some of these shoot out an offensive projectile, while others characters work defensively. These are all learned in a specific order, so if you were to say find your first earth crystal late in the game, you would learn the most basic spell. There's a lot of variety when it comes to these attacks. Personally, I tend to prefer the ones that stun lock enemies as they allow me to get in close with a melee weapon for an extra hit, but there are quite a few ranged attacks to mess around with as well. Be careful though, as you can inflict damage on yourself if you walk into your own magic. The same goes for enemies, so it's a good trade-off. Baddies can hurt each other, so it's extremely fun lining them up in a path to see them toss projectiles at one another. Larger spells tend to make the MP bar refill slower, which is kind of an obvious penalty. I found it all to be very balanced. It was fun to alternate between melee and magic in the first entry, but this time around, the stamina gauges seemed to drain much quicker, making it a less effective strategy. The boulder spell in Elden Ring started here, people. A special nod has to go to one particular series of events that has you swapping out a magic crystal all Indiana Jones Raiders style. Health and magic stamina depletes with every attack or movement. When the energy meter is at its peak, a blow does more damage. It's satisfying to duck, weave, strafe, and position yourself in order to inflict the maximum amount of destruction. Heavier arms drain more energy, and leveling up makes you permanently stronger. Bows with arrows, crossbows with bolts have been introduced and are really satisfying to use. They do heaps of damage and they control very well. The menus are well designed and intelligible. Okay, so it would have been nice if there was a way to match the digits in real time, but this wouldn't be a feature implemented until far later in the FromSoft lineage. The frame rate is inconsistent, to put it lightly. When there are more than a couple of enemies on screen, it really tanks. In the throes of battle, the speed differences are quite jarring, and possibly the only hint that this thing was optimized in a hurry. Texture warping is also prevalent throughout, but hey, this is a PS1 game, so it's hard to complain. Overall, I'd say the translation is pretty good for its time. There are quite a few moments where the localized text was off, but humorous enough to get a chuckle out of me. This time, it's possible to select multiple items at shops, which is such a huge improvement. It would have been nice to be able to refill multiple flasks from a water source, but I'll take what I can get. A quick slot has also been added to the menu, making it possible to use an item with a tap of the select button. I normally reserve this for health replenishing herbs. It saves so much time, as you'll no longer have to interrupt gameplay. Koji Endo and Kaoru Kono return with yet another amazing soundtrack packed to the brim with interesting, moody pieces. This time we have rich, expressive short loops of haunting, atmospheric arrangements to complement the island's many areas. My personal favorite is the theme that plays throughout the first gate, where the organ returns, accompanied by funky Les Claypool bass licks. Every track is different and does a good job letting the player know that they've entered a new area. It reminds me of Kenji Yamamoto's work on Super Metroid. The compositions are catchy without ever becoming overbearing, a perfect score to highlight the atmospheric visuals. It's just a bummer that it pauses while cycling through the menus. I'm not sure why they thought this would be a good idea. like its predecessor, Kingsfield 2's soundtrack is one of my personal favorites on the PlayStation hardware. Layered, complex, and incredibly well written. It's a shame there are only 10 unique pieces, but they would later rectify this in the next series entry. The sound effects are just as good. There's nothing sexier than the satisfying plunk a key makes, and the creepy groans made by creatures throughout Melanat's dark caverns adds a lot to the overall atmosphere. Kingsfield is a cohesive, well-crafted game from top to bottom. It's much longer and more open than its predecessor, with tons of paths to explore. The fact that it's non-linear makes it entertaining to replay, and the greater emphasis on characters is a nice addition. This is a hell of a game, people, and an example of how proficient the developers at From Software were from the very beginning. Check out our review of the first entry in this trilogy for more. Next time on this channel, even more Kingsfield, so stay tuned.